Sandra Hale tiene una larga trayectoria como intérprete de conferencias y en los servicios públicos y, de hecho, es reconocida internacionalmente por su labor en este campo. Ha participado como ponente invitada en conferencias internacionales y como profesora visitante en distintas universidades de todo el mundo. Realizó la primera tesis doctoral sobre interpretación judicial en Australia, en la Universidad de Macquarie, y ha coordinado los cursos de grado y posgrado en traducción e interpretación de la Universidad de Western Sydney. Ha sido cofundadora y coeditora de la revista Translation and Interpreting y es miembro del consejo asesor de la prestigiosa revista Interpreting. Es autora de libros de cabecera en este ámbito, como son The Discourse of Court Interpreting, el discurso de la interpretación judicial, y Community Interpreting, interpretación comunitaria. Es una investigadora incansable que participa en numerosos proyectos financiados y en colaboración con investigadores de otras disciplinas y, de hecho, yo creo que podríamos seguir hablando de su impresionante trayectoria, pero en resumen, para nosotras ha sido un referente, una investigadora muy admirada, muy inspiradora para nuestros proyectos también, y es un verdadero honor poder contar hoy con ella en esta jornada dedicada a este tema. Y sin más dilación pasamos a escucharla. Gracias, Sandra, por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias por esa introducción tan amable y muchas gracias por haberme invitado. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con todos ustedes y de ver a muchos viejos amigos de aquí de España. Y antes de que me pregunten por qué tengo un acento argentino, porque soy argentina. ¿Encontraron? ¿No? Que no me gusta sentarme porque soy muy bajita, entonces prefiero estar de pie. Pero bueno, me siento. Voy a hablar en inglés porque es más fácil hablar en inglés cuando tengo toda la información en inglés. Así que cambio al inglés, pero sí, obviamente si quieren hacer preguntas en español también podemos hablar en español después. Bueno, mejor así. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the topic of my presentation is the impact of court interpreting on evaluations of credibility, and that's what I was asked to talk to you about. And I'm not sure how many in the audience are people from the judiciary or lawyers. Can we have a show of hands? Anyone here who is? Okay, so we have some people who. All right, so this is, I teach the judiciary a lot in Australia, so I go all around Australia to teach judges and magistrates on issues relating to interpreting, how to best work with interpreters, and what are the major impacts that are important in a situation where an interpreter is present. So today I'm going to talk to you basically about the results of research that show the impact of an interpreter in an interpreted situation. So when we talk about issues of, okay, what happens when an interpreter is present, we need to go beyond the anecdotal and into the empirical to show what effects there are. And so we cannot say, well, I don't think so, or I think so. If the research proves it, then we have to do something about it. Having said this, we know that research is not infallible, so, but it is a step beyond the anecdotal. Okay, so research has shown that interpreters can have an impact on the outcome of a case. So there is quite a lot of research that has shown this, so we can't deny the fact that there will be an impact when an interpreter is present. And the range and type of impact depends on many different factors. And so some of the factors may be the one that we all talk about, the interpreter's own competence. So the interpreter's competence and ethics. So professional ethics will have a major impact on the way interpreters behave, and that impacts on their performance as well. So we've seen this over and over. But there are other issues that may not be as obvious to people about factors that can impact. Well, one of them is specialist training, specialist education, and in this case we're talking about specialist legal court interpreting training for interpreters. and also for the users of interpreting services, because as you will see, it is a shared responsibility. The success of an interpreted event is a shared responsibility. We cannot blame the interpreter for all of the issues, and we cannot make the interpreter solely responsible for the success of an interaction. And this is why I'm talking about these other factors that can impact on the performance. And the third one is a very, very important one: the working conditions. The conditions under which interpreters work will have a major impact on their ability to interpret accurately. And the best interpreter will not be able to interpret accurately if they are not provided with the right working conditions. So that's something that needs to be understood. And including in the working conditions are the provision of materials to prepare beforehand. If the interpreter does not have everything that is required of them to understand what's going on, they will not be able to interpret accurately, no matter how much they try or how much people will pretend that they are interpreting accurately. If the people they are interpreting for do not know how to work with an interpreter, do not express themselves clearly, are incoherent or speak for too long, or there's overlapping speech and so on, that will also have an impact on the interpreter's ability to interpret. So these are extremely important points that cannot be disregarded. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of the research that I've done that has to do with legal interpreting, the more recent research. I'm not going to go back years. And the impact of interpreting on legal outcomes. And the goal, having said that there will always be an impact, because it's not the same and it will never be the same as a monolingual situation. There'll always be an impact, but the goal is to minimize that impact. And so how do we minimize that impact? That's what we have to look at, because the main role is to try and place the person who does not speak and understand the language of the court in the same position as someone who would. So not in an advantageous position and not in a disadvantageous position. So how does the interpreter in that equation fit that role? And we know that the interpreter can do that, but with the help of everybody else. Okay, so in Australia we have the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department, who quite a long time ago now, 1991, published what the role of the interpreter is. And as we can read it here, the interpreter's role is to put the non-English speaking witness or defendant in the same position as an English speaking witness or defendant. It is not the interpreter's role to simplify language or arguments used in the courtroom to ensure that the non-English speaker understands them. It is a major misconception that an interpreter should assist out the non-English speaker by reducing a complicated argument to a simple one. If the original message is not clear, the interpretation should remain unclear. So that's been the basis of the role of the court interpreter in Australia. Now, it doesn't mean that it's easy to achieve. Knowing what the role is does not make it simple or even achievable. And that is the ultimate goal. But how achievable is that? It will depend, again, on many aspects. And it may not sometimes ever be achieved in some situations. So what's important here is that the interpreter should not be held responsible for making sure that the person understands. That is the role of whoever is the author of the utterances. So in a legal situation, it would be the lawyers who are asking the question, the judge who is presiding. It's up to them to make sure that the person understands. And so, as it says, if the original message is unclear, the interpretation will also be unclear. And the interpreter should not be blamed for that. Another important thing here is that the interpreter is not to simplify the language, but if the original language is incomprehensible, then the interpreter will not be able to interpret that either. And I'm talking about incomprehensible in terms of too formal, too complex, without the advantage of having studied it beforehand. So as we know, conference interpreters are provided with the background materials to prepare in order to be able to interpret accurately. This rarely happens in a court situation for interpreters. So I talked about those factors. So with regards to the first one, competence and ethics, so the interpreter's knowledge of the role and ethical requirements to be accurate and impartial, that is crucial. If interpreters don't know this, there is no way they can do it. And how can they know this? Only by being trained. It is not an innate knowledge. We're not born with this knowledge of how to be an interpreter, what is ethical, what is the requirement, what is my role. And normally what we train people to do is contrary or in opposition to what comes natural. So what comes natural is for someone who is bilingual to try and help out, to make things simple, to make things understandable. And that is not the role of the interpreter. We know that the role of the interpreter is to interpret faithfully. So what does it mean to interpret faithfully in a legal context? And accuracy changes according to the context. So what is accurate in a legal situation, or the other way around, what's accurate in a conference situation may not be accurate in a legal situation. So that's something that is very important to understand. Knowledge of legal discourse. And by legal discourse, I mean more than terminology. By legal discourse, I mean the strategies, the way that language is used in order to achieve certain purposes, the strategic use of language. And if interpreters don't know this, they will inadvertently interfere with those strategies, and things will change unbeknownst to everybody else, because this is, in inverted commas, the power of the interpreter. The interpreter is the only one, in most cases. Some countries obviously differ, but in Australia, for example, the majority of cases, the interpreter will be the only one who understands both languages and will very rarely be challenged. And often things go unnoticed because no one knows, unless there's something very obvious, no one will know that there's been some misunderstanding, misinterpretation. And if we go even further into the nuances of legal discourse and strategies, that is even more difficult to detect for people who are not trained in that area. But we can't deny the fact that these things do have an impact on the outcome. How much, how little is almost impossible to tell, but we know that they do have an impact, so we can't disregard it and think, okay, we can figure it out as we go along, and just a basic knowledge of the language will do. And specialist training, I've already mentioned. So a number of studies of speech style in general in the courtroom have demonstrated a strong correlation between the way witnesses deliver the testimonies and the evaluations they receive from the listeners. So there's been quite a lot of study, quite a lot of research in the English-speaking world about the fact that the way witnesses give the evidence is as important as what they say, because they are being judged and assessed not only on the what, but on the how. So how they say what they say is very important in the evaluations, especially of credibility. So that's something that's been proven many, many times in research that's been done for many years. And one seminal study that was done in the United States by Obar and colleagues has looked at the difference that what they call powerful and powerless speech make. So powerful speech basically relates to the way that the powerful members of society speak that give them an advantage over others. What sort of advantage? That they are assessed differently, they are given more respect, and they are believed more because of the way they speak, whereas powerless speech is the opposite. They started looking at this on the premise that there were two types of language styles based on gender. So what used to be called female speech and male speech. And they found that although some linguists continue to look at the differences between male and female, but what they found principally in the court discourse was that it wasn't so much an issue of gender, but it was an issue of education, social status, and so on. So the powerful members of society, the educated people, spoke in one style, which they renamed as powerful. The less powerful people spoke in what they renamed as powerless, which had the characteristics of what female speech used to be seen as. So here they didn't see the differences between female and male, but differences between background. So this is an example of powerless style. So we have the question, state whether or not Mrs. A you were acquainted with or knew the late Mrs. X. The answer is quite well. What was the nature of your acquaintance with her? Well, we were very close friends. She was even sort of like a mother to me. Okay, so that's the type of language that is considered to be powerless because of these extra characteristics such as hesitations, upward intonation for statements instead of downward, a lot of fillers and hedges, discourse markers such as well at the beginning, and so on. So they extracted all this information from real data and then they converted it into segments for experiments. And so they asked the same sorts of things to different people to evaluate and they changed the style. So the same question sequence is now presented as a powerful style. So the same question, state whether or not Mrs. A you were acquainted with or knew the late Mrs. X. Yes, I did. What was the nature of your acquaintance with her? We were close friends. She was like a mother to me. So you can see the difference. The content is the same, but the style is different. Now, without almost exception, the powerful style elicited better evaluations of the witness who produced this information in the powerful style, both or mostly for credibility, but also for competence, intelligence, trustworthiness, and so on and so forth. So this has been replicated many times with the same results. Now, what's the interpreter influence on witness credibility? So research has also shown that interpreters who are unaware of the importance of speech style and the manner of the testimony concentrate only on the content, thus affecting the witness's assessment of credibility. And Susan Burke-Seligsen's done work to show this, I have done work to show this, that unless the interpreter is trained in a very specialised way in legal interpreting, they will do what they would normally do in other settings and concentrate on the content, on the sense, and not on the way that that content is presented. And so this is a natural way to filter out, to make it easier because the cognitive load is very high. And so if you don't know that if you're not aware of these features and the usefulness of these features, you will automatically omit them. The minute you become aware of them, you start to recognize them, and then you have strategies, if you're trained, to include them to maintain the same style. The same with so we're talking about the style of the answers, but the same can be said for the questions. Now, I've got here a few examples from some of my authentic data from some of my research, where the first one you can see that the answer in Spanish is what would be regarded as powerless, and the answer in English is what could be regarded in English as powerful, disregarding the addition of the shiny blade of the knife. But you can see that it's very different from the original, and the perception that that answer would have would be very different from the original. Another one is the opposite, where the answer is neutral, and the reinterpreter makes the answer more aggressive. So that's another change of pragmatics. So that's the tone, the intonation, the tone, the force, the pragmatic force has been changed, and that will create a change in the evaluations. So changes to style, register, levels of politeness, all impacted on assessments. So this was later assessed through experiments, and that's what it found. But what my experiments found was that when interpreters were accurate in terms of these extra features, there was no statistically significant differences between the assessments of both. So what showed was that even with the intervention of a third person who is an interpreter, who looks and acts differently from the original speaker, if they were able to interpret accurately at this highest level, which includes the manner as well as the content, it didn't impact significantly on the evaluations of credibility of the witnesses, which is very, very important. There are other influences beyond the interpreter's control. So that what we talked about is the interpreter's specialization, training, and competence and ability to interpret at this very high level. But there are other issues that are beyond the control, which I won't go into. One is accent. Some interpreters cannot help having an accent if they learned a second language after a certain age. So that's something. Now, we conducted a small project, a small study in Australia, where we were expecting, because other studies elsewhere have found that a non-native accent has a negative impact on those who hear it, but not through interpreters, but witnesses themselves. We were expecting to find that negative result, but we found that with interpreters who had an accent that was not a bad accent, but a foreign accent, they could still be understood, and we did it in Arabic, Spanish, and I think Chinese, I can't remember now, it's too old. We found that there was no impact on the evaluations. And this was done in Australia in a very multicultural area. So we presumed that people were very used to foreign accents and it didn't bother them to hear them. So that's another interesting research that needs to be enlarged. The other point is the mode of interpreting, whether interpreters interpret in the consecutive or the simultaneous mode, and I'll tell you about that. The physical appearance, the position, the status of the interpreter also can have an impact and reflect on the person that they are interpreting for. And so I'll tell you a little bit about these projects. So the first one was a major project on the difference that the mode of interpreting makes or can make. And this is, these are the chief investigators, so I work with different teams, multidisciplinary teams with people from different perspectives, so from lawyers, sociologists, obviously linguists, interpreting experts, and psychologists. This is funded by the Australian Research Council. So the methodology included observations, interviews, questionnaires, and a mock trial. And I won't go into everything because it's far too much to talk about, but I'll talk about the mock trial, which is the experimental phase. The script was based on a real case, and it was acted out by professional actors. And this is because we needed to minimize the effect of the acting. So we had to reproduce this many, many times because we had 449 jurors that had to assess the situation in different ways. So we had approximately 50 randomly allocated to each condition, and there were 3 conditions. There was a monolingual control, and then 2 interpreted, 1 consecutively and 1 simultaneously. So there were the experimental conditions. And we also had 3 time slots because that had an impact as well. So we had 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and 2 p.m. time slots, and the cases were in a real court. Now, I'm going to stop to ask if the interpreter is keeping up. Yes, yeah, okay. All right, good. All right. So the research questions. Was there any difference between the monolingual and the 2 interpreted conditions regarding jurors' concentration, understanding, and recollection of case facts? If we go back to that statement of the role of the interpreter, where we said that the interpreter was to put the person in the same position, then what we are aiming at is that the interpreted outcome would be the same or not significantly different from the control, the monolingual situation. So that's what we are aiming at. The further away it is from the monolingual, the less successful we can say the interpreted situation has been. Now, was there any difference in the juror's perception of the accused between the 3 conditions? And was there any difference in the conviction rate between the 3 conditions? So the answer to the first one was interesting. The answer was yes. The time of day made a difference to the jurors' level of concentration and their ability to recall the facts of the case. In particular, consecutive interpreting tended to distract jurors more in the afternoon. So overall, the consecutive mode tended to distract jurors more, but more in the afternoon when the jurors were obviously after lunch more tired. So that's something to keep in mind if it can be done, that preferably the interpreted cases should take place in the morning. And in observing the courts, I cannot believe how disorganized courts are with the listings. And yet this is something that is not insurmountable. It can be fixed with proper organisation, where all interpreted cases can be put together so that interpreters are not wasting time waiting around. And this shows that it will be better for the concentration, not only of the interpreters, but also of those who are judging them, including judges and magistrates when juries are not included. The second answer is yes. With consecutive. So if we go back to the second question, was there any difference in the jurors' perceptions between the three conditions? And yes, there were significant differences when it came to interpreted situations using the consecutive, but not the simultaneous. Now, I have to stress that we didn't check, this is not a real interpreted situation. We scripted the interpretation. So we translated the script as perfectly as can be translated, including all the features that I mentioned before, the powerless speeches, the features, the powerful, the intonation, the force, and we trained the actor, who was the interpreter, to maintain all that, and she learned the script. She didn't have to interpret. So this is something that is not real because we didn't want to include the variable of having good interpreters, bad interpreters, the accurate, inaccurate, and so on. So we're only looking at the mode. And the last one was interesting because at the end, even though people had different opinions of the interpreter, of the witness through the interpreter, either seen or not seen. So the consecutive interpreter was seen, whereas the simultaneous interpreter was in a booth, not seen, as we are having now, the experience with the interpreter in the booth. And so when the interpreter was in the booth, the evaluations of the witness were more negative than when the interpreter was visible. But that negative evaluation was the same as the monolingual situation. So there was no difference between the evaluations of the accused when heard without an interpreter. They looked at the accused, they heard the accused speaking in English, the same accused, and there was no difference between that and when the accused was speaking in Spanish and they heard the interpretations through the headphones. So they were still watching the accused but listening to the interpreter. Whereas with the consecutive mode, they were watching the interpreter, listening and watching the interpreter. So that had an impact on their evaluation. So the good image of the interpreter reflected on the accused. So we can surmise that if the interpreter was a bad interpreter, then the opposite reaction would have been achieved. But then at the end, when in the common law system, it's very difficult to convict someone because you have to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt. And so people tend to be more lenient in convictions. And so there was no significant difference in the rate of conviction. And we have to keep in mind that the interpretation was very accurate. Okay, so there was no issue there. Okay, I mentioned that. So what are the practical applications of this research? I've been working in this field for many years, and in addition to being an educator of interpreters and doing research, I also educate the judiciary. As I said, I've been doing it for many years, and I try to be an activist for improvements in working conditions. And it can be very disheartening at first when you first start and there's an uphill battle and nobody seems to understand what you're talking about. But I can tell you that after 30 years, I can see differences. I can see many differences in attitudes from the judiciary. I can see how they are now very keen, and obviously not everybody, but more and more, it's increases as time goes on, very interested in improving the situation and in making sure that interpreters are being seen as professionals, that the courts, the administrators are starting to look at what is more useful, and now there are architects, for example, who are designing new courts who are asking about where should the interpreter sit, for example. So we're hopeful that things will continue to improve. And one thing after this research is that, at least for trials, there should be interpreting equipment, simultaneous conference interpreting equipment in big courts for trials. It would make it so much easier for everybody, including not wasting the time of having to listen to the consecutive. But obviously it needs well-trained interpreters to be able to interpret at that level in the simultaneous mode. Okay, so the next research, which we were funded for now, starting this year, will now look at whether it is possible to achieve the same level of accuracy using both modes. So at the moment we saw the effect of the different modes, where simultaneous is very close to monolingual, but we don't know exactly if interpreters can achieve the same level of accuracy. So that's the next research project. These are some of the publications that you can look at. The next one is, now how much time do I have? When do I finish? Because I know I started. 10 minutes? Okay, so, because I started late, okay. This one was accuracy in bilingual interviews and the difference that training makes. And this was a project funded by the FBI under this high-value detainee interrogation group. We looked at the differences in interpreter performance, including accuracy, management skills. Management skills, when interpreters, and this is not in the court, this is in an interview situation, when interpreters know how to introduce themselves, how to set the role, how to interrupt when needed, how to seek clarification when needed, and so on. And we looked at the interpreter understanding of the role. We looked at the formal training and the physical placement of the interpreter, whether having the triangular situation, which is what we teach students as the optimum, made any difference when the interpreter was not in that triangular situation but was seated behind, because that's one of the practices that they're trying to impose on interpreters in the US, thinking that it will make the interpreter less intrusive. So they are working with untrained interpreters, and what they're finding, and I'm sure everybody knows this, is that untrained interpreters interfere by offering their own opinions, by not interpreting everything, by making comments, by having side conversations. And so what they thought would help, instead of the obvious to me, which is training, is to move the interpreter to a place where they can't talk, have conversations. So that was the idea. So we tested these two positions as well. Another thing that was very important for the police was in the new police interviewing techniques, rapport building is crucial. It's a completely different strategy of how to interview suspects from the old coercive type. So this is a friendly rapport-making strategy so that people feel comfortable in coming up with the answers. So that's another point that was very important. So we had experimental and discourse analytical methodology, scripted interview with actors, again based on a real case, and real interpreting. So here we had real interpreting, not actors for the interpreting. The actors were only for the police and the suspect. And there were video recorded, transcribed and coded, and we have 100 Spanish-speaking interpreters. Some of them were untrained bilinguals, and some of them were highly trained interpreters. So it was a big range. The untrained, they all had a very good level of bilingualism, so that wasn't a variable. Summary: trained interpreters were more likely than bilinguals to perceive the role as neutral and a duty to interpret everything that was said. So that was one result. Trained interpreters were superior on the 7 separate accuracy measures consistently. And the overall accuracy rating, trained interpreters versus untrained, 71% versus 47%. And these are, well, we use different types of assessment, but it's, you know, obviously not an exact science, but you can see the difference between the two. So the things that we assessed were propositional content, manner of speech, the rapport features being maintained, using the correct protocols, such as using the first person, asking for clarification and letting the other person know if they were speaking in the other language and so forth, the correct use of legal terminology, the ability to manage the turns, and the language competence. And you can see that the language competence, there was hardly any difference between the two groups, but the others, there were significant differences statistically. Trained interpreters were more likely to reproduce, this is interesting, we didn't expect this, but they were more likely to reproduce verbal oral markers, and oral, the thing that I'm getting mixed up. So yes, verbal rapport markers than bilinguals across the 7 types of rapport markers, so 81% versus 53%. And rapport markers were things such as the use of the first name, acknowledgement of the other person's answer, the solidarity, saying, you know, yes, I understand you, and so on. Trained interpreters were unaffected by position. This is interesting. The trained interpreters were reluctant to move. Halfway through, we asked them to move for technical reasons. They were reluctant to move. Some of them said, I can't interpret from that position. But despite the reluctance, they were able to interpret as well as in the triangular position. Whereas for the untrained ones, they were bad no matter what position. So it didn't change anything. The trained interpreters were rated more knowledgeable, trustworthy, confident, and likable than the untrained bilinguals by the interviewer and the suspect. They didn't know what the background was, but very significantly more positively. So they understood that the flow was better, that the interview was a much better interview when professional interpreters were, trained interpreters were involved. So what are the applications? Number one, that bilingualism is not enough because all of these people were good bilinguals. So that's not, you know, any longer. I don't know if anybody ever continues to think that way, but I think they do. That interpreter education and training with legal specialisation is crucial. What we found was that the highest the level of training and the more specialised the training was, the better the performance of the interpreters. So, and I just have a PhD student who just submitted her thesis, who found the same with Chinese. The more trained they were, specialist training received, the better they were at maintaining accuracy. The accuracy of interpretation includes both the manner and the content, and interpreter competence also includes other things when it comes to these 3-party face-to-face interpretation situations. The interactional management skills are crucial, and we saw how, and we deliberately put in the script, difficult, challenging situations where the suspect spoke to the interpreter and said, don't interpret that, you know, I want you to help me, what should I do, to test what the interpreter would do. And similarly, the police saying something derogatory about the suspect and telling the interpreter not to interpret that. What did the interpreters do? The trained ones explained at the beginning that they had, before they even knew what was going to happen, that they had an obligation to interpret everything. So if there's anything you don't want the other side to hear, please don't say it because I will interpret it. And then when these situations came along, they said, I told you I have to interpret everything, and everything was interpreted. Whereas the untrained ones kept quiet. So many things were missing. Presentational skills, role definition, and ethical stance. An interpreter who knows his or her role is an interpreter who will do what is required of them and who will perform well. An interpreter who doesn't know the role will do whatever everybody else pressures them to do. So they'll just switch and, you know, they'll do whatever they want, which most of the time will not be an accurate rendition. So what are some of the external factors on interpreters' work? As I said before, working conditions, working in pairs, having adequate breaks, adequate physical facilities, preparation materials, and respect and status. And these are things that I teach the judiciary about how they can help the interpreter achieve a better performance for their own benefit. If we think about it, the interpreter has nothing to gain or to lose from being accurate or inaccurate. The interpreter will go home after the event. The good ones may feel bad if they felt they didn't do a very good job, but that will be the end of it. The bad ones won't even know that they've done a bad job, so it will continue. But who will be impacted by this? The person, the people, it's not just one person, the people who are the users of the service. And who are these people? It's not just the person who doesn't speak the language of the court, it's the court. It's the judge, it's the lawyer who are placing the trust on the interpreter, just as I'm placing my trust on my interpreter here, and I can be confident that she will do a good job because I know she's trained, I know she's experienced, and I've given her my preparation materials. And we talked about it before we started. So a professional relationship needs to be established, where the interpreter is there not just to, this migrant who doesn't speak the language, well, anything will do. No, the lawyer cannot do his or her job properly with a poor interpreter. The judge cannot do it properly. And the judicial system and justice itself cannot be done if the interpreter is not up to the standard that is required. And again, I stress that it's not only the interpreter's responsibility, because an excellent interpreter will not perform adequately without the proper requirements. So what are some of the solutions? And I'll share with you some of the things that are happening in Australia, which I'm very proud of and hopefully will lead to better improvements. There is a document that's about to be launched that I was involved in producing, which will be called Recommended Standards, National Standards for Working with Interpreters in Courts and Tribunals, which include all of these issues that I heard the previous speaker talking about in one document. So this will be a document for all courts, for all judges, educational material as well as protocols, what to do when this happens, what not to do when that happens, what's the optimal choice to make, how should interpreters work, how should interpreters be addressed, and also educational material for interpreters as well. So it's a document that will be of use to everybody who is involved in interpreting in courts and tribunals. And we hope that, it does have the support of the National Council of Chief Justices, and from that top level it will trickle down to all the other levels. Funding needs to be, we need to have funding to do more applied research so that we base our decisions, we inform our decisions on research and not just on anecdotes and on our own opinions. Compulsory education and training for interpreters and legal professionals. There's no way out of it. We cannot expect people to just guess what they have to do. We need to train them, and both sides, not just one side. In Australia, NATI, which is the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, has just undergone a big review, and one of the recommendations in the review was to introduce specialist certifications, and that's going to happen with legal being one of them, with compulsory training to achieve that certification. And hopefully once that is in place, then the courts will give preference to those interpreters who have that specialised certification with training. We have to be realistic that there are languages for which this probably will never happen, because in Australia we have so many languages. NATI accredits in over 100, but there are many others that are not accredited, and we have we call languages of lesser diffusion, the new and emerging languages of refugee communities, who, will take them a while to get up to the standard of, say, Spanish or German, Chinese, Arabic. They're the big languages for us. The other point that is something that we can't hide is remuneration. if the remuneration is not adequate, the good interpreters will leave, and that's happening. And so, you know, that's one of the saddest things for educators, to see our best graduates only lasting in the field for a couple of years and then moving on to something else because it's, you know, they don't get recognised, they don't get paid enough. And that's very sad. And that's also included in this big document about remuneration. Inadequate interpreting affects everybody, and effective communication is a shared responsibility. And I'll finish there. Sorry for extending myself. Thank you.
I'll speak in English, Sandra. G'day, how are you? My name's Lorne Walker. I used to be a police prosecutor in the Northern Territory. I'm now living here in Barcelona. You talked about the languages of less diffusion. In particular in the Northern Territory, in the outback regions, you've got a lot of Indigenous Aboriginal languages. How much progress, I was practicing there 15 years ago, how much progress has there been on education and training for Indigenous interpreters?
There has been some progress. It is a very difficult situation. The Supreme Court of the Northern Territory has done quite a lot of good work. If you go to the website, for anybody, if you go to the Northern Territory Supreme Court website, they have, I did a report in 2011 which recommended protocols for the courts, and they did come up with a protocol based on my recommendations in that report. So they actually are ahead of others in many respects. The magistrates' courts also adopted that protocol. They have the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, which is funded by the government, and they have a type of career path for the interpreters who work there, and they have in-house training. But yes, that doesn't mean that the level is up to standard for all of the practicing interpreters, and that's something that a lot of people are working on. If these standards are adopted, then that will put more pressure in trying to raise the levels, increase and improve the training for all of the different language groups. But there is a lot of work being done. So
I know it's especially problematic because you have some Aboriginal languages with many speakers and you have some that are quite minor, and it's not just about interpretive education, it's more education in general for some of these some of these people. And also you talked about the effects on juries with some of the studies that you did, bearing in mind that most criminal trials in Australia, certainly in my experience, were non-jury. They were heard by a single magistrate. How did you do any of these training exercises with the judiciary?
Yes, yes. The research is done with juries because it has a wider impact, but the results can be extended to single fact finders. So, you know, the jury, we have more people, but, you know, we can extend it to the judiciary when they are the ones who make a verdict. But I trained magistrates and judges, yes, so I've been training them for a long time, yes.
You would expect them to be a bit more open to training, but also due to some of them are perhaps more set in their ways as well.
But it's changing, generational change I can see, yes, it's changing.
Okay,
So
gracias.
it's good.
Está obert, ¿no? Hola, buenos días, Sara. Soy intérprete jurada, no ejerzo mucho en juicios, pero me ha llamado la atención una cosa. Has hablado del powerless y el powerful discourse o speeches. Me estoy imaginando la situación en que tenemos un acusado, por ejemplo, de baja condición social, que usaría, según lo que has dicho, un discurso powerless, que no sé cómo lo diríamos en castellano. Claro, tú estás recomendando que nuestra interpretación sea también powerless. Pero claro, a este acusado a seguir en su miseria, si nosotros transformáramos ese discurso en un discurso powerful, podría él acceder a una defensa de mejor calidad, ¿sabes? En el sentido de que
Sí, entiendo lo que dices. Bueno, yo te pregunto una pregunta. ¿Qué pasa con un español que habla español de esa forma y no tiene a nadie que le ayude a elevar ese nivel, ese registro? ¿Quién lo ayuda?
No, claro, nadie. Lo que pasa es que ese español no tiene un intérprete, pero el extranjero que habla otra lengua sí lo tiene. Y
bueno,
no podríamos, mi pregunta, no podríamos aprovechar esa circunstancia.
¿Pero ese es el papel del intérprete?
Pregunto.
¿Y cómo sabe el intérprete, cómo sabe el intérprete si esa persona es culpable o inocente?
¿Y si no es una estrategia de mismo de carácter?
Eso el intérprete no puede decidir si la persona es culpable o inocente. Lo que me estás diciendo, estás pensando que la persona es inocente, por eso que lo querés ayudar. Si no, no lo quisieras ayudar, porque si es un asesino, bueno, no, ¿para qué vamos a ayudarlo? Pero el intérprete no tiene ningún derecho de hacer ese juicio. Por eso lo que tiene que hacer el intérprete es permitir que esa persona se comunique de la forma que se hubiera comunicado si hablara esa lengua del juicio, del tribunal, y después dejar que el jurado, el juez, todos los que lo están juzgando, lo juzguen. Pero no, el intérprete no puede cambiar para mejorar ni para empeorar, porque ahí entonces te estás dando otro papel que no es el papel del intérprete.
Claro, entiendo. Me dices, estás pensando que el acusado es inocente. No, en realidad te sirve para los dos. Porque lo que estamos diciendo es que cuando uno usa un discurso powerless se convierte en un testigo, en un participante powerless, sin poder. O sea, se está condenando, tanto si es inocente como si es culpable, ya por solo ese hecho de usar este tipo de lenguaje, es decir, por ser de procedencia de clase social baja, se está condenando. Entonces, sería una actuación para eliminar esa condena.
Bueno, eso lo puede hacer el abogado. El abogado puede hablar por su cliente y puede mejorar cómo presenta la causa, pero el intérprete no es el abogado de esa persona. El intérprete está ahí el cliente no es el cliente del intérprete, es el cliente del abogado. El intérprete es completamente imparcial. Entonces, si el juez sabe que el intérprete está abogando por esta persona para ayudarlo a tener mejores oportunidades o lo que sea, como intérprete perdiste tu credibilidad, porque no te van a llamar más, porque no importa de qué tenés que ser completamente imparcial. Lo mismo puedes decir por cualquier otro tipo de trabajo. Un juez tiene que ser completamente imparcial. Y nosotros, o sea, podemos ver muchas injusticias, pero podemos pelear para rectificar esas injusticias en nuestra calidad de persona, de ciudadano, pero no en la calidad de intérprete. Si a nosotros no nos gusta que esto ocurra, que es algo natural, que no es algo legal, el hecho de que una persona te juzgue por la forma en que estás hablando no tiene nada que ver con lo legal. Es natural. A mí me están juzgando ahora, cuando nos hablamos nos juzgamos, es algo que es inconsciente. Entonces, no podemos intervenir en eso. El intérprete tiene un papel muy claro y si te vas a ir más allá de eso, no vas a ser intérprete, vas a ser una persona que está luchando por los derechos, que está fantástico, ¿no? Pero no cuando estás ahí en calidad de intérprete.
Ya, de acuerdo. No, digo porque, a ver, sucede en otros ámbitos de la interpretación, por ejemplo, en interpretación comercial, un cliente, un proveedor, pues el objetivo de esa reunión es que se pongan de acuerdo y que haya una compra o una venta o lo que sea.
Claro,
y claro, a veces sucede que el intérprete pues ayuda, oye, aquí pregúntale esto o pide...
Eso es diferente porque el intérprete sí tiene un cliente y no es imparcial. Esa es otra situación completamente diferente. Sí.
Vale, de acuerdo, gracias.
Bueno, pues gracias a Sandra.